Our guest was one of the pioneering figures in U.S. pot reform and activism, and he's also been an influential business figure in the legal cannabis world. And he's also behind one of the biggest dispensary chains in the United States, and it's going public on Monday in Canada. We're joined by Steve DeAngelo, co-founder and chair emeritus at Harborside. It's great to see you.
Well, thank you for having me, Andy.
So when did you first start demonstrating, campaigning for legalization of pot in America?
So I organized my first cannabis demonstration at 16 years old. It was in 1974. So I've been at this for a while.
Yes, you paid your dues. And are you happy to see with what's going on, legalization in more and more states? Well,
I'm thrilled. My basic goal is to make sure that everybody around the world who needs cannabis has safe and affordable access to it. And the only way that happens is by engaging the mechanisms of global commerce, like the Canadian public exchanges. So it's a very exciting time.
Like any substance, it affects different people differently. But for you, you say it's really essential to your life, the way you live your life.
I've been a steady cannabis user since before I was 16 years old. It has always been a friend and a teacher and a comfort to me. And I've seen it work that way for many, many other people.
But I've got to ask you, you remember the old type grass, and then you probably remember in the 80s, I think it was the 80s, the wheelchair grass came along, the skunk grass. It's a very different product, isn't it, these days?
No, I don't think it is that different.
Okay.
If you take a look at the potency levels of really good cannabis, those of us who had access to good cannabis back in the 70s and 80s, there's been some increase in potency, but it's not orders of magnitude.
I wonder, are you selling it short a bit there? You're a connoisseur. You would have had access to the good stuff, but normal people couldn't get anything like the strength, I think, that they get today.
There's definitely been improvement in potency. I don't think it's orders of magnitude.
Oh, okay. Well, I won't argue with a great expert there. Now, tell us about Harborside before I forget. When did you get into pot retailing, and what is Harborside?
So Harborside was one of the first 6 legal cannabis businesses in the United States. We were licensed in 2006 by the city of Oakland, which was the first jurisdiction to license commercial cannabis activity.
And this was medical in those days, I believe.
It was restricted to medical cannabis. We could only serve people who had a recommendation from their doctor until 2018, January 1st, 2018.
And then a grey market grew up in California, I think it's fair to say, as in lots of other places. In California, in some cases, people would get a prescription, and it was under rather murky circumstances. I'm not saying it was necessarily you, but you worked in a grey area like so many other people in pot.
I would describe it more accurately as a very loosely regulated area.
Sure.
The state of California did not regulate cannabis at the state level until 2018.
Oh.
And so many jurisdictions like Oakland were forced to take that job on their own. And we ended up with a patchwork of different types of regulation that was not tremendously effective.
I mean, we won't get bogged down in California, but they've still had some glitches, haven't they? Some areas, pot shops haven't been able to open.
Yeah, there are problems, I think, with any system of regulation when you first unroll it. That's certainly been true in California, but we're working through those issues.
Now, I have seen some other pot activists, Jody Emery, one of our most prominent voices, complaining that big business is taking over the cannabis industry. And I know in BC, for example, craft growers have said, we're being squeezed out here. Is that a concern you have?
Well, sure, it's a concern, right? But I'm sort of split down the middle. On the one hand, my mission is to make sure this plant gets into everybody's hand who needs it. And we only do that by engaging the global mechanisms of commerce, right? On the other hand, it's true that many of the people who grew up in the gray market, who developed their skills in the gray market, who have devoted their lives to cannabis, are finding that transition to the mainstream business market to be challenging, and they need some help and deserve some help.
Now, you had run-ins with the law over your activism. And is it hard for you to get across the border, for example, because of your past legal troubles?
No, Canada has always been very welcoming to me. I've never been denied entry to any country around the world.
Can you remind us, do you have convictions, though, for cannabis?
I do. I have a felony conviction for distribution of cannabis, and I have a few other more minor convictions for cannabis possession.
Now, you and other activists also say that people shouldn't be in jail. They should never have been jailed for cannabis, in particular people of colour, who we've heard were particularly victimised by these laws. So you're involved in the Last Prisoner Project. What's that all about?
So the Last Prisoner Project is a project to raise funds, to put together a team and mobilize an army of lawyers to make sure that every single cannabis prisoner on planet Earth is released. And we will be going to the new legal cannabis industry and asking them to fund this organization.
I know that some historians of cannabis, and we're getting into controversy here, think that the whole campaign against the drug was racially motivated.
Well, there's no question that the original campaign against cannabis was racially motivated. If you go back and you look at the original legislative records and see what the legislators were actually saying, the words came out of their very mouths. They were talking about the people who were using cannabis, not the substance itself.
Because it was originally, well, the word marijuana, I believe, is seen as a slur by some because it was used in reference to the drug being used by Mexican laborers.
Well, you'll notice that I use the word cannabis. There are a lot of different terms that are used for cannabis. Some of them are really freighted with stigma, and marijuana is one of them because it was popularized more widely than anybody else by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in order to make cannabis, which was then being sold in pharmacies legally in the United States, seem foreign, seem like a threat.
So you avoid the M words generally.
I do.
Like, yeah. It's such. Are you surprised that we've seen such a rapid turn in attitudes to legalization?
The only thing that really surprises me is how long that it's taken. If you look at the inherent properties of cannabis, how beneficial it is for so many different health-related conditions as a raw material for industrial purposes, the only thing that surprises me is that it's taken so long to persuade the rest of the world that this plant is something that should have a respected place in our society.
And you're also involved in hemp cultivation, non-psychoactive, because you say there's important benefits to that plant too.
Hemp can be a replacement raw material for trees, for petroleum, for cotton. It can be grown without fertilizers or pesticides, and you can make about 25,000 different products out of it.
Yeah, it's interesting how it's a weed and it doesn't need all this chemical stuff put on it, all right. That's what we hear. I should ask you, can you give us any kind of a revenue figure for Harborside? I know you have to be cautious in advance of
Yeah, well, see, all of our financials have been filed with our listing statement, and they're available on the CDAR system.
Okay, yeah.
The important thing to remember when you look at our financials is that up until 2018, we were required by law to be nonprofit. And so we had a number of plant-touching nonprofit entities, and we had a for-profit management entity that managed them. So the numbers I'm giving you now reflect aggregated revenues for all of those entities, right? And so in 2018, we are at 63.9 million Canadian dollars. And in 2019, we expect to be at 104 million Canadian dollars revenue.
Okay. Yeah. And have you had a chance to go into one of our few legal pot shops here in Toronto and try the material at all, the product?
I have.
Were you impressed? We have heard complaints.
I was not impressed. I think that most people in Toronto that I know who understand cannabis are still buying it on the gray or illicit market because the quality and the prices in the legal shops just don't match what's available otherwise.
What was wrong? I mean, I know real connoisseurs want a beautiful bud. So are you talking about aesthetic problems, or did you just think it was particularly low quality?
So what I noticed was that the cannabis had an extremely low terpene profile. Terpenes are the substances that give everything in the world aroma and flavor, and they're extremely important to the cannabis consumer. And what I saw was, unfortunately, mostly terpene-free cannabis. It just was not very attractive.
Didn't have that rich smell, yeah.
Yeah, and effect is also driven by terpenes. So there's two active compounds in cannabis, cannabinoids and terpenes. They interact with one another. And so a lack of terpenes really robs you of about half of the potential of cannabis. And I think that hopefully that will improve over time. One thing that we need to understand with cannabis, with regulations, with new cannabis businesses, is that few human endeavors are perfect right out of the gate the first time. So we're working on it. We'll get there.
We'll have to leave it there. Steve, thank you very much and welcome to our city. What brings you here in particular?
Well, I wanted to talk to you, and we also have the LIFT conference in town here this weekend, which is one of the major North American cannabis trade shows, and there will be thousands of people there that I'd like to link up with.
Thank you very much, Steve. It was great talking to you. Steve DeAngelo, one of his many hats, many roles, co-founder and chair emeritus of Harborside, the big dispensary chain.